I will not become your wife. Please forgive me, was Elizabeth's categorical response to Albert's proposal. But the prince was not going to give up, because his love for this smiling girl was so strong that he proposed to her not once, but 3 times. Albert Frederick George was born in 1895 during the reign of Queen Victoria, who was his great-grandmother. He was the second of 6 children of Prince George V. Many might call Albert a backup prince, since his older brother was the heir to the throne. This modest and shy boy has always remained the second in his family. As a child, his family called him Bertie and considered him a sensitive child. From an early age he suffered from a stutter, but his passion was dogs and horse riding. It all started when Albert was only 10 years old, and he accidentally met his future wife Elizabeth at a holiday where a brave 5-year-old girl treated the prince to cherries from a cake. Over the years, Albert had the honor to receive an excellent education, and he devoted many years to service, first in the Navy and then in aviation, despite his poor health, remaining a devoted smoker throughout his life. In his youth, Bertie entered into an affair with a married woman named Sheila Chisholm. However, his father intervened in his personal life and insisted that his son end this unseemly relationship by granting him the title of Duke of York in exchange. Subsequently, Albert met Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon again and was fascinated by this girl. Elizabeth came from a prestigious Scottish family and was the 10th child of the Earl of Strathmore. Her character was distinguished by determination, and she completed her education at the University of Glasgow, becoming the first woman in the royal family with a higher education. Like Prince Albert, she shared his love of animals and passion for sports. Albert was not embarrassed that Elizabeth was the daughter of a peer and did not have royal blood. Despite liking the prince, Elizabeth did not plan to marry him out of fear of responsibility, strict ceremonies, and the attention she would have to face in the royal family. Therefore, in 1921, she rejected Albert's marriage proposal. A year later, she again refused the prince, which led to the fact that Albert was worried and lost sleep, becoming a monogamist. Interestingly, the prince's mother, Queen Mary of Teck, supported him in this story and believed that Elizabeth would make her son happy. No one then could have imagined that Albert would inherit the throne and his wife would become queen. Finally, after Albert's persistent courtship, Elizabeth agreed to marry him, and in April 1923 their wedding took place, when the groom was 27 years old and the bride was 22. After the honeymoon, the couple went on a diplomatic tour to Africa, and soon the press nicknamed Elizabeth the Smiling Duchess for her openness and benevolence. This marriage was full of harmony. 3 years after the wedding, their daughter Elizabeth was born, and 4 years later a second girl, Margaret, was born. Albert was a devoted father and constantly spoiled his daughters. The family was extremely close, and Albert called them all our four. He even gave his eldest daughter her first puppy, and this moment left a mark in history, as Elizabeth II adored dogs all her life, especially corgis. In 1936, Albert's father, King George, passed away, and his elder brother Edward VIII ascended to the throne. Then the story unfolded, which is still being discussed. Edward abdicated after just 11 months for the sake of marriage with twice divorced and not from high society Wallace Simpson. The couple got married and left the country. Now the burden of responsibility fell on Albert. In 1937, the reserve prince ascended the throne as King George VI. Everything that Elizabeth feared when she got married came true, and they became the first couple in the country, with their lives constantly in public view. Elizabeth insisted on treating her husband's stuttering, realizing that the monarch needed to confidently make speeches and communicate with people. Supported by his wife, George worked hard on his speech with the famous speech therapist blog. Elizabeth spent hours rehearsing speeches with her husband. These efforts were not in vain, and the king eventually overcame his stutter. Many biographers have noted that Elizabeth had a huge influence on her husband. She accompanied the king at all public events, always looking elegant and smiling, and was always there to support him. George was a man with broad views. He rejected racism and did not pay attention to social differences, which was quite bold for the upper secular society of that time. During Second World War, the king was determined to stay in England with his family, refusing to leave the country. He actively participated in the war, meeting with residents of London who suffered from the German bombing, inspecting the destruction and visiting military factories. Interestingly, George, like other citizens, used food cards introduced due to food shortages. The king and queen became symbols of national resistance. In 1940, Buckingham Palace was bombed, but the king's family remained intact. Elizabeth headed the Red Cross, visited the wounded in hospitals, and made patriotic speeches on the radio. It was for this reason that Hitler called her one of the most dangerous women in Europe. For her bright outfits and optimism, the Queen was called the Rainbow of Hope by the British. In 1942, she organized a fundraiser to help Stalingrad and was deeply impressed by the feat of the Soviet people in the defense of the city. King George ordered to forge a gift sword with an inscription, which was presented to Stalin by Churchill at a conference in Tehran in 1943. On the sword was an inscription, "To the citizens of Stalingrad, strong as steel," from King George VI as a sign of the deep admiration of the British people. During the war, King George visited the territories liberated from the Germans, including North Africa, Normandy, and southern Italy, where he visited soldiers and in every possible way raised the morale of the inhabitants of Britain. After the end of the Second World War, King George VI faced the collapse of the British Empire, when many colonies and countries embarked on the path of independence, among which were India, Ireland, Ceylon, Pakistan, and many others. Their happy marriage, which lasted 29 years, allowed King George VI to decide to allow his eldest daughter to marry a Greek prince for love, even despite the doubts he had about Philip about the right match. In the final years of his life, King George VI often suffered from illnesses and battled lung cancer. As a result, in 1952, he died at the age of 56. After the loss of her husband, Elizabeth went through his departure hard and lived in Scotland for some time. Despite this, she continued her life for another 50 years. Elizabeth Bowes passed away in 2002, having lived to 102 years, and her famous daughter, Elizabeth II, ascended to the British throne.